This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute. I am your host, Gilad Halpern. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We are counting on you. Every week, my co-host Dalia Shandlin and I bring you interviews with authors, books, research, and other things that have caught our attention. Dalia is sadly away this week, so it is my pleasure and mine alone to welcome Professor Ruth HaCohen-Pinczower to the show. She is a professor of musicology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and co-author, together with the late Professor Yaron Ezrachi, of a book entitled Composing Power, Singing Freedom, the Interplay Between Music and Politics in the West. It came out in Hebrew by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute Press and is forthcoming in English. Professor Ruth HaCohen-Pinczower, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So before we tackle music and power, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the power of music. What is it really about music that gives so much meaning to our lives?
It's a very good question. And of course, it's in the heart of our argument, because without understanding it, you don't know why politics is enlisting music for its own sake. So I would, in this context, would point to two major qualities of music. One is the fact that it is the most public of all the arts, I would say, in the sense that not just it is played in public from time immemorial, but people are being enacted through music in public. And the major phenomenon that we know in this connection is, of course, the fact that people are singing together. While they are singing together, you can see that a dispersed group of individuals are becoming one, kind of one soul, coalescing in one community. And that's a very important quality that was exploited during the 20th century many times, and perhaps later on we'll speak about that. The other thing relates to the fact that music is such a fluctuating phenomenon with all these nuances of the music itself. It has the possibility to change itself incessantly, much more freedom in the sense of the very matter of the art than, for example, language. And in this way also creating all sorts of shades and nuances of moods and emotions that the individual or the group can possess. So it's both very individual, at the same time, very public. The two can cooperate as well.
What about the fact that, I don't know, maybe it's unlike other forms of art, that it's at the same time art and entertainment, and therefore it lends itself to the possibility of being subversive on the one hand, and as you said earlier, and we'll talk about it at greater length in a minute, it can also be co-opted.
Sure. But I wouldn't divide music along these lines of art and entertainment. Of course, this is a very well-known one, but you don't know exactly what sort of art will turn into entertainment and the other way around. And something which is considered entertaining can be very subversive in certain moments. Just think of all those hymns and songs that we will overcome. Would you think that this is a kind of a sublime artistic song? It is not, but it becomes such a mode of protest, if not subversion itself. So what becomes what relates very much to the particular moment in which music is being enacted by an individual or by a group, or the circumstances, whether it's which kind of regime it is being enlisted for or against. So all these different parameters should be taken into consideration when you think of the way that music plays its part in politics.
Also, there's a part of the argument in your book is that there are some structural elements to music that, again, make it lend itself to a certain political order.
That's very true, because what we are trying actually to do in the book is to speak about how diverse musical forms, musical events, particular musical works, practices, musical practices are deployed for the sake of, as you said, legitimation or delegitimation of all sorts of regimes. And what we are trying to do is to speak about what musical forms or genre or style is illicit for what sort of regime? Monarchy, republic, a liberal social democracy, as well as totalitarian regime. All of them are doing different things with music, or those who are using music will do different things in relation to those regimes.
Whether there are any parallels between certain types of music or certain genres and certain types or of movements of political cultures, etc. How can you categorize and classify them, if you can at all?
Yes, we can, but I wouldn't say that it's one-to-one. It's not. Speaking of analogies is always quite risky, in the sense that things are working differently. Still, I would like to say that for the monarchic regimes, you find that they were enlisting music that was very artistic music in order to enhance, to empower, especially the absolute monarchies, empower their own kingdoms, especially at that moment in which feudal systems somehow collapsed. I'm speaking now beginning of 17th century, 18th century, and they had to find new ways to legitimize their newly conceived monarchies. And they wanted somehow to endow their rule through some idea of harmony. So harmonious music, what was considered as harmonious music, was very well fitting into that sort of idea. And there was something very interesting about this sort of enlisting music, because at the time when that took place, the very idea of world harmony that was in vogue for millennia collapsed because of all sorts of changes in physics and metaphysics. But still it worked as a sort of allegory. And so you find that those again, very powerful rulers like Louis XIV or those, for example, Frederick the Great in Prussia, they were trying to find ways in order to aggrandize their especially their courts by enlisting those musicians that could enhance or could glorify that which they were doing, but in a very interesting way, which means that they also invited their composers to think anew of what harmony means. Harmony was not the kind of thing that is built from top down, but rather from bottom up, which is also something that started to take place at the same time, especially when we're speaking about a very important political thinker like Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan. Mm-hmm. And I would like, what was new? And that's very interesting because it changes the way that people were thinking on politics in parallel with ideas that were becoming more and more central in music making.
Take us through the whole mental process that you're presenting in the book.
So we are speaking about what Thomas Hobbes were suggesting in his important Leviathan, and what he elaborated was the notion of social contracts. A social contract is a means to found a coherent state in the absence of divine guidance. the idea of the divine right of kings collapsed at the time, and he understood already the first half of the 17th century to develop the idea of sovereign as an artificial person, not as a natural one, not as a divine one, and one that is constituted by the people to govern the state and protect their security. Now, how this works, according to Hobbes, through social contract and radical individualism. That was the very basis for liberal democracy later on. Now, the idea was very, very different from the kind of democracy that you had in Athens, because the notion of representation became so important. So what is representation in this new idea of politics? Representation meant not just that you are electing your representatives, your sovereign, one in a term of 4 years or something like that. But while these people, once these people were elected, they are starting to negotiate. They are negotiating their own ideas, their own platform, if you want, with reality, with the other candidates in that democracy, and with their own constituency. So representation is a kind of an ongoing process. Something very similar happened in music at the time. First of all, for the first time in Western music, it's very important to note, by the way, that we are speaking here about the Western world.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a bit.
Yeah, no, it's very important because we're not speaking now of other possibilities of how music and politics can work.
No, absolutely. The subtitle of your book, it says clearly in the West.
Yes, sure. So I just want to emphasize that something very interesting is happening in the beginning of the 17th century in music. And this is the rise of the opera, and with it the idea that music can represent or can give vent to the personalities of all sorts of fictional heroes that are playing their own selves on the stage in action. Now, what was so unique about this idea is that playing yourself is playing your own emotions. And emotions, as we know, is never standing still. Are never standing still. The person is changing while he or she is expressing their innermost selves. And while doing so, they are realizing that they were starting in one thing and now they are becoming something very different, especially when they are conversing with other persons in the same scene or same drama. So what we are trying to emphasize is the idea of representation while shaping yourself, while shaping your own country, if you want, or your own nation, or your own party, but while representing yourself through the music. And that's how music became a way to look into the ways that people of all walks of life can live themselves while performing themselves. The performance became something important, much more important in politics as well as in music.
Do you think that either the musicians themselves, the performers, and the rulers who were wielding the political power, were they aware of this interplay in real time? Where, I don't know, a composer in Frederick the Great's court who was writing pieces for the emperor, was he aware that he was doing something for the benefit of the nation?
The composer or the king?
Both.
Both of them. I think that they were aware. It depends when exactly you're speaking about. For example, thinking about very famous and important moment in that history is the moment of Beethoven, beginning of the 19th century. That he was very well aware of the fact that he is Beethoven and he has the power as an artist to say what he believes in that particular moment in history. That was the moment, the famous one, in which he wrote his Eroica, that symphony number 3, and in E flat major. that was a time in which Napoleon actually transformed himself from a kind of enlightened ruler into the sort of tyrant that he became. Now, he started to write the symphony before he realized what was going on with Napoleon at the time. But while he was finishing it, he understood that it's not the same person. So he dedicated, especially the second movement, the second very famous movement, the funeral march of that symphony, to Napoleon. But when he heard what sort of ruler he became, he tore this dedication and turned it into something else, to a hero in a kind of an abstract way. Every person who is doing what he really believes, or she is really believing it. So he was very well aware that what he is doing now will affect all sorts of people, because he became the famous Beethoven that he turned to be. But not every moment was like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there were those moments in which composers were very happy just to serve their rulers. Yet you can find, even in those moments, subversive elements, as we are trying to show in the very glorified court of Louis XIV. There was his composer, a very famous composer, Jean-Baptiste Lully, was Italian by origin, and he started to write French opera. That was a new thing at the time. And while he was writing it, he was somehow led through the plots and through the music to compose something very different from the idea for which he was writing or composing that work. Because there are powers within the intricacies of libretto and score that could turn the meaning of that which you set yourself to do into something very different. And so we are trying also to show that there are powers within that interactions that will lead the major actors in that big drama of music and politics into new areas, new possibilities.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the interplay between the music itself and the text that usually accompanies it. How do you analyze that, perhaps the tension or complementary nature of that relationship?
In general, or in particular in relation to our subject? I will say something general in the beginning, and then I'll move to how it's being exemplified in relation to the subject of music and politics.
Mm-hmm.
So the relations are, I would say, kind of in a rather crude way. You have the text. A poetic text is usually something that you can interpret in many different ways. Comes music and starts to somehow determine how to listen, how to hear that sort of text. So it interprets it in a certain way. Of course, you can interpret the music further, that you are taking something and then it becomes something very dignified or something very sad, or all sorts of other things and with the nuances as well. And also it becomes, as I said in the very beginning, it can become public. So it creates through that music the text in a certain way that then many people are sharing that is the meaning of that text because they heard it through the music. I would like to give you an example of the other way around, how music affects the text.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very interesting example that we were very happy to find when we worked on it. There is a trilogy, it's called the Civil War trilogy, that was composed in the end of the 50s, the 1950s and the 60s, which tells the story of the Civil War, American Civil War, of course, in the 1860s, and with lots of just sort of sarcasm and criticism of which happened. It was exactly at the centenary of that war. Now, that was a moment in Israel music in which composers and poets went to American music in order to take from their new ideas, examples, and so on. So there is one whose name is Chaim Hefer, and he heard that trilogy, the 3 different songs that were connected into a sort of one rhapsody, if you know, one scene, big scene. And he was inspired by the music. So the kind of text that he wrote, which was aimed to commemorate the battle that was in the castle during the, again, war that was in the past, during the 48 war in Israel. And he was a person that was very much in the establishment. But he created, because the music, that American music, somehow prompted him into something that he did not actually plan in this way. And it became a protest song. And so what is it that was in the music that created him to, or that pushed him to write it in this way? I can say that it is the fact that it was not the kind of music that you had at the time for heroic songs in the young Israel. It was much more sort of playful. It had moments of tra-la-la, and that he had something to do with them, and so he solved it in his own way, in a very accomplished way, poetically, but at the same time something that's worked against perhaps his own intentions. And it's very interesting that song, which is called in Hebrew Kavar El, was later on dismissed from the canon. Now, young Israelis, they don't know it anymore, because those who are responsible for the canon somehow felt that it does not really fit into how the Israel as a nation wishes to commemorate its slain soldiers, yes, dead soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really prompts a whole new area for discussion, really, about suppression and censorship. Where does in what context is there backlash from the rulers, from the politicians on music? Where do they think? Where do they realize that there might be some subversive potential there that they should suppress?
That's interesting. I can give you an example from Russia. It's not included in the book, but it's something that later on I discovered. In Soviet Russia, there was a very popular practice which had to do with trying to smuggle records from the West, Elvis Presley, all sorts of other things. Now, the music unto itself had nothing in it which called for rebellion or any sort of unrest. But the very fact that it was music that came from the West was the thing that's against which the government tried to work. Now, what they did, the people who tried to consume that music, and became a sort of community, of a tacit, of an invisible community. So they took the slides of X-rays, because they figured out that it's a kind of a soft matter on which you can engrave the music of, analogically, of course, that's the way that this technology worked to begin with, to engrave the music that they really liked. And they were making many exemplars of the same sort of music, and no one was the same as of the other, because they did it kind of each copy was made individually, and they either diffuse them in a kind of a free way, or they sell them. They sold them, and in that way, they created a kind of subculture. So creating subculture in a kind of totalitarian regime, something also the Nazi regime sensed. That's why they prohibited jazz music. And so the fact that it represented the opponent, the adversary political power, was enough for them in order to prohibit it. But sometimes those attempts to decide which music should be out of the, not just of the canon, but out of the reach of the people, resulted in moments of great, I would say, embarrassment and misunderstandings, especially when you're speaking about instrumental music. The very famous case is that of Shostakovich. Dmitri Shostakovich, when he the premiere of his Fourth Symphony, the Stalin and company, they thought that the music is expressing that sort of moods that will lead people against the establishment, against government, and they were very furious with him, and it became quite dangerous for him. And so immediately that was prohibited, and the next time that it was performed was only in the late 60s, not in the 60s, 20-something years later. And then the Fifth Symphony became the symphony that they somehow cherished or endorsed.
Because Shostakovich learned his lesson.
Yes, but the people who heard that, they were hearing in it very different things. They were trying not to cry in the moments that they were supposed to cry. But in the very, very end, it ended in a kind of a happy music. But that music was for them not happy at all. And they heard it as, we must be happy. All of us must be happy. It's like in the Israeli song, which is known everywhere, Hava Nagila, Uru achim li belev sameach, which sometimes people saying, Muchachim liot sameach, we must be very happy. Mm-hmm. So this is something which is very collective sort of regime or a polity is trying to impose on their people. You should be very happy. If you're not happy, that's your problem.
But maybe at the end of the day, the question is really about the legitimation of the regime. And when the regime enjoys a certain degree of legitimacy, they can allow themselves to co-opt the music in a way that serves them. And when they don't, it quite naturally turns against them because the people interpret it in the way that they want to interpret it, and that is increasingly against the government.
Yes, legitimation, I think, is a very, very important thing because the exact, the very sometimes subtle interplay between legitimation, freedom, power, enforcement of power is something that every polity is very conscious about. They cannot make it too tense, that kind of tension.
Mm-hmm. Because it might break. Yeah.
Yes, it might break. Exactly. So very wise rulers or leaders can turn music into something which is going to be very positive. Like, for example, the moment of Barack Obama, he was going to that church in Charleston, South Carolina, and in this obituary that for the that member of the Senate that was murdered in this church, while he's giving this speech of freedom, to end it with a musical moment, that's famous musical moment, Amazing Grace. and turning all the people in the community into a more unified, reconciled people. After that, which happened to, of course, the fact that he was a black president was very important, but he knew how to react at the moment. Of course, he planned it. He knew exactly what he was doing. But if you are watching that YouTube and seeing how exactly he is introducing that spiritual into his speech, and with it, bringing the people into his own, they were already enthusiastic, but they were much more. And also he, at that moment, provided them with the kind of, as I said beforehand, reconciliation and appeasement that they needed in order to continue as a community. And of course, it became a symbol for his entire presidency.
Just before we wrap up, I'd like to spend some time on your choice to focus on the West, as you said earlier, and is also, as we said in the subtitle of the book. Is it in the West because the West has a certain political culture, or is it because of Western music that this interplay works specifically in the Western context?
Why we took the Western culture, first of all, because we know much better. We knew
but can be applied to a non-Western context. I mean, the same sort of insights that come out of the book.
It's very difficult to answer this question. First of all, because there's something very specific about Western music and Western politics that were taken into consideration when we wrote the book. First of all, music history in the West is much more well documented. So you know exactly when things changed. We had the music itself from the 7th century, 18th century, and we knew exactly what was played at a certain moment in that history. So from that point of view, we can work it in much more detail than had we when we gone to another culture or civilization. That's one thing. The second thing is that the political thoughts that accompany the changes from early modern to late modernity or postmodernity in the West is backed up with all those writings that we know about, and we know how they related to the political situation at that moment. So what we try to do is actually to mingle all of them together and think how they were reacting and interacting with one another. Yet at the same time, I would like to say another thing is that even what we call popular music, and my last example is very much related to it, was very much affected with the way we think about Western music at large, because the musical grammar of those genres, in a way, was taken from what that sort of tonal harmony that developed and evolved in art music, what we call art music. And it became as such a language for multitudes, for masses. So it enabled us to speak both about that sort of music that was very unique and subtle and rarefied, and that's in the chords and in special moments. At the same time, speak about music for the masses and look at all of them as related to one another. And they are related both historically, generically, politically, in many, many different ways.
Professor Ruth HaCohen-Pinczower, a musicologist at the Hebrew University and co-author of the book Composing Power, Singing Freedom. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And also many thanks to Itai Shalem, our producer, and again to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any sort. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has just about 600 interviews And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Dali on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.